Hey guys, Ron here. So, tonight I'm doing something, this is very unusual. I've never done a movie review before, and this is historical. It's based on a pseudo biopic. So, at the time of this filming, there's a movie out simply called Elvis. Now, personally, I've been thinking of writing an Elvis movie for 20, 30 years. I love the Kurt Russell Elvis movie. That was a TV movie directed by John Carpenter in 1979. John Carpenter, the guy who brought us Halloween, the film. Anyway, he did a TV movie and then a string of movies with Kurt Russell, The Thing, and Escape from New York, Escape from LA. Anyway, and now there's a theatrical film, which again should have been done 20, 30 years ago, simply called Elvis. And Baz Luhrmann directed it. And it's getting a lot of praise, a lot of glory. And the first thing I said, because I'm quite the Elvis expert, I was very reluctant to watch it because I knew I'd be, yelling at the screen, "That's not true, that's not true, that's not true," or whatever the case may be. And I didn't know if I could get past the fact that the actor looks absolutely nothing like Elvis. But I watched the movie, and now I'm going to give you some fact versus fiction. I understand the spirit of the film, and a lot of people love it, and a lot of people are going to be upset with me because they're going to see it multiple times. And yes, it's got great energy, great spirit, but the fact is it's about 95% inaccurate. I don't know whether they deliberately didn't do research or they wanted it as a sort of a pseudo fantasy, because it's like a fantasy film. It feels fantastical, like a fantasy with some moments of clarity and drama interspersed in, but maybe it's just because it's stylized. But it's about 5% accurate, and I'll go over that with you. Hang in there, because I've done some other videos on Elvis. This will be an adjunct to those. Okay, so the film takes us through all of Elvis's life. They couldn't have put everything in. I mean, they weren't able to put anything about Jesse Guerin, Elvis's twin who died at birth, and Elvis's very special relationship, very close, although sometimes contentious relationship with his mother. But they glossed over the relationship with his mother. I mean, they show him as a child going to the Black Baptist churches and singing along and loving that. And he did. I don't know if he ever had a moment where they portrayed in the film where he leans back like the spirit is within him. But he did go to those churches, and he did love gospel music. And if he would have been a gospel singer, which was his true calling, his life would have been a lot different. Anyway, they kind of glossed over the relationship with Gladys, his mother. Gladys, by the way, was way too thin in that film to be Gladys Love Presley. But they were accurate in the fact that Gladys really had a hard time dealing with Elvis's fame, and she didn't like the way she looked, and she did have chickens at Graceland. That was true. But there's a line where they have Elvis saying to her, "You're drinking too much and you're taking too many pills." Well, he got his pill-taking habits basically from her. And later on, well, starting in the Army, really, just a couple of years, actually the year she died. And as far as drinking, yes, she was drinking too much, but I doubt whether Elvis actually said, "Leave this guy sleeping," whether actually said directly to her, that she was drinking too much. But of what she was. Anyway, I just want to say a general comment that Tom Hanks plays Colonel Parker, and he's got this very odd voice like this, and I have no idea why Hanks uses that voice, because Parker had a very normal, what I'd call normal, like you, like me, normal sounding voice, unaccented English. So why he speaks like this throughout the film, I really have no idea. If you want to hear a little bit of the Colonel, although there were interviews with Colonel too, but there's a famous Madison Square Garden interview with Elvis, and he's wearing like a blue blazer and a blue suit, and Colonel comes out at the end and he says, "All right, guys, I got to keep my reputation as a nice guy. We got to call this press conference now." He just has one or two lines, but you can hear his real voice, and it was nothing like the Tom Hanks voice. The whole thing about, Elvis and Tom Hanks at the carnival and in the Hall of Mirrors, all fake, all fiction, none of that happened. Actually, Elvis, when he auditioned for Grand Ole Opry, he was told that he should go back to driving a truck. And he was, I don't think that rejection really got to him. That was for the audition. He also kind of bombed first time he was in Vegas in the 50s. He did not do well. It wasn't his crowd, and he didn't ever want to go back. But as we know, he did, and 15 years later. Anyway, so what else did they talk about early on? Well, yes, the actor certainly didn't look like Elvis. I mean, Elvis was more masculine looking. This young actor, about 28, 29, 30 years old, was much softer than Elvis ever looked. And I know it's hard to find somebody who looks like him, but all I can say is they sure make Kurt Russell look like Elvis and sound like him. Now, the actor had Elvis's voice down, his speaking voice, pretty well. I mean, it wasn't 100%, but I'd say it's 75, 80%. He did a pretty good job. And the songs he did sing on, which weren't all of them, but the ones he did a really great job too. Okay, so let's talk about when the reality of when they kind of skimmed. They have just Gladys one day collapsing and Vernon finding her and calling the maid. Well, in reality, Gladys had been getting sick for some time. In fact, the guys who they totally not only underrepresented, the so-called Memphis Mafia were not represented in this film at all. They had one scene where they talk about the guys and they're in a car in a stylized view, all wearing sunglasses. But in reality, you have to understand, Elvis knew Red West from high school. Sonny West was Red's cousin. He met Lamar and Joe Esposito. I don't think they mentioned Joe at all. He met Lamar and Joe in the Army, and Charlie Hodge. And he knew Marty Lacker from Humes High. And Billy Smith was his cousin. That was the Memphis Mafia. Now, Jerry Schilling came later in the 60s. And actually, Jerry grew up in Memphis too. But my point is, they have only one so-called representative of the Memphis Mafia throughout the whole movie, and everything is Jerry. Jerry, what do you think, Jerry? Jerry. And Jerry, the character who looked nothing like the real Jerry Schilling, Jerry's the only one who gets to speak. There was no representation of the other guys. And what I'm telling you is the guys were with Elvis the whole time. For 20 years, they were with him every day, just about every day. Elvis was never alone. They portray a scene in the movie where Elvis goes by himself down to Beale Street to meet up with B.B. King and meet up with as yet unknown Little Richard, although I thought by that time Little Richard was famous himself. And Elvis did follow through and record Tutti Frutti, Little Richard's song. But anyway, I guarantee you Elvis was not going anywhere alone once he already had that record out and once he was famous. Now, before, when he was driving the truck for Crown Electric, like they portray in the film, yeah, he'd go off alone or with a girlfriend, but there's no way he would have went to Beale Street and everyone's coming out in the street cheering him on and recognizing him, and he's by himself. And the fact of the matter is, Elvis was certainly a huge celebrity, but he didn't make much of a dent in the black community. It was really, he had a pretty serious white fan base. So I don't know how many of those residents would have come out cheering him as he was one of their own, like B.B. King. But that notwithstanding, him going out alone never would have happened. Didn't happen. And as far as the whole thing with B.B. King, he was an acquaintance to B.B. King. I don't remember any of the guys ever saying that they were close friends. I think acquaintance is the best word that fits it. Now, that's another thing about Elvis that you have to know. There are a lot of celebrities through the years and people through the years. Elvis was my good friend. Elvis and I were friends. According to the guys, and I believe this wholeheartedly, he wasn't really comfortable, Elvis, unless he was around his group of guys, his parents, and then obviously just his father, and his girlfriend or wife at the time. Elvis did not go to Hollywood parties. He didn't go to Hollywood restaurants. He didn't go out that much in Memphis. He'd rent movie theaters by himself and his friends. He was renting movie theaters into the 70s. He rented a movie theater in 1972, and that's where he met Linda Thompson, who became his companion, his girlfriend for the next, until the last year of his life, from 72 to 76. So my point is that lots of people throughout time, including the actor Bill Bixby and other people, said even Ali, Muhammad Ali, they were acquaintances. Elvis really didn't have any good close friends that he saw on his own that much that were outside of the group. A lot of acquaintances, but for whatever reason he didn't get close with a lot of other people, and he was an introvert and somewhat shy even in high school. I don't think it ever really changed all that much, even though once he became quote unquote Elvis, he had the biggest ego in the world, sort of. So some of it was a fake ego. So let's move on. What else did they portray? Well, Elvis going in the army. Well, Elvis thought this would ruin his career and his life. He was deeply depressed about it. In fact, Elvis in the army, which they kind of skimmed over, they showed him getting his hair cut, showed him in his uniform once when he's hanging out with Priscilla, who didn't seem 14 in that scene at all. But anyway, I went forward. Gladys, his mother, had been jaundiced and getting sicker and sicker. By the end, she really was yellow. I mean, and Lamar was saying, "You've got it. If this was my mother, I'd have her examined in the hospital." And they finally did bring her in, and by the time she started getting medical attention, Gladys, she was already dying. And the night that she did die, Elvis came to visit her in the hospital with, I think it was Lamar, and he was sitting around the hospital room, and Gladys said, "You should go out." And he says, "Well, I thought I'd go to a movie. Is that okay?" And she said, "Just come back and see me in the morning." Well, he went to the movie. He came back. He was sleeping, and I think Lamar was even in the room at the time. And purportedly, Elvis woke up in the middle of the night and said, "Oh, God, something's wrong." And then he got the call from the nurse. She was already gone. But Vernon couldn't talk on the phone. He was too beside himself. So the nurse told Elvis, "You better get down here." They drove to the hospital. They left the car in park, and I think it went over an embankment, and the motor running ran up, and it is said that Elvis and Vernon were wailing so loud with their crying and tears that it was an unearthly sound like Lamar, or whomever he was with, had never heard before. So you can't underestimate the depth of sorrow that Elvis felt for the rest of his life about the loss of his mother. And he did cling to the casket. He did carry her nightgown around for weeks afterwards. And he did try, before she died, to get an emergency leave when he was still stationed in Texas before he went to Germany to go see her. They didn't want to let him go. Elvis said, "If you don't give me an emergency leave to go see my mother, who's in the hospital possibly dying, I'm going to hold a press conference and shit all over the Army's reputation for not doing this for Elvis Presley. And believe me, I'll get the goddamn sympathy." And boy, did they snap to it and got him his leave. So that's what happened with Elvis's mother. Now, as far as Priscilla, yes, Priscilla was 14 when they met. They met in Germany. Priscilla did come back to be at Graceland, but the truth was, they show them happily in love, presumably. I believe wholeheartedly with all my heart that Elvis did love Priscilla, and I believe Priscilla loved him. I actually don't know. I shouldn't make that statement, but I know that Elvis has said many times he didn't want to get married. He didn't want to get married to anyone. He didn't think he was cut out for marriage, and he just wanted to be free and unattached and play the field, and among other reasons. And Colonel Beaulieu, Priscilla's father, basically forced him to marry her, and that's what it was. And that's what happened. 9 months to the day after the wedding, little Lisa Marie popped out. So then we have Elvis doing the movies. Well, yes, they portrayed it correctly. He did want to be a big movie star. He wanted to be a serious actor. Interesting, they didn't show Loving You or Jailhouse Rock or King Creole. I mean, up until Elvis went in the Army, Jailhouse Rock and King Creole, he was doing really good films. Both those were excellent films, especially King Creole. He got great notices as being a dramatic actor. They didn't show those in the Elvis movie. And then, like I say, when Elvis they portray in the movie that Parker is saying, you're going to be patriotic, you're not going in special services, you're going to be one of the guys. That's all true. But Elvis didn't go along with it and say, "Oh, Mama, it'll be fine." Elvis was crushed, destroyed. He really didn't want to go in the Army. He didn't want to work. He knew his mother was worried sick, and he thought in 2 years he'd have no fan base left. So when he went, it was really bad emotionally on him. Now, he got to live off base in a house with the guys and his parents, but and he was still in contact with Anita Wood, his girlfriend from before he met Priscilla in Germany. And it was a wild time there in Germany. I mean, the guys say that when they went on leave to Paris, the guys had a party with the entire Moulin Rouge dancing girls, and the girls almost missed the show because they were partying it up with Elvis and the guys. Yeah, it was very hedonistic in those days, especially in Europe. So, Elvis's mother dies. Elvis goes off to Germany. Elvis meets Priscilla, who was only 14. Elvis goes back to the States. She goes back to the States. She goes to live at Graceland with Elvis. Now, this notion of... First of all, nobody called him EP. Throughout the movie, they're calling him EP. Nobody ever called Elvis EP. They just called him E. Now, so they sort of zip through the 60s and a few of the films that he did. No mention of Anne Margaret, who he had a major relationship with, and Priscilla knew about it and was extremely jealous, which is totally understandable. No mention of the films that he did through the 60s. But then when the films, and then the fact that the film quality was worse and worse and worse and worse, and that Elvis really wanted to get away from those shitty films that Colonel was making him do, basically. Remember, Colonel was getting 50% of everything. Okay, so then Elvis wanted to return to the stage. He did do the 68 Singer Special, the so-called comeback special. Now, first of all, Elvis, in the film they have Elvis, and I don't know why they call him Bindle. His name's Binder, or Binder. But they never met at the Hollywood sign. That just never happened. They met in Hollywood. I mean, they met in offices, but they never met at the Hollywood sign. Now, Colonel was expressing interest to the producers of that show that he wanted to be a Christmas show. And out in the hall, they would tell Elvis, and Elvis said, "Don't worry about what he wants. I'm going to do what I want." The point is, it was that whole episode of Elvis doing the Singer Special, and interesting too, they show Elvis playing his guitar and singing on stage, but the guys were there too. They brought back Scotty Moore and Bill Black. They showed a little bit of that, but not entirely. That was actually pretty well executed. It looked like him. He sounded like him. They did position, women sitting around the stage like that. Colonel knew that he was going to be... There were rehearsals for the show. He wasn't shocked that Elvis was doing what he was doing for the 68 special. Everything was choreographed and set. And the whorehouse scene was cut from the final film. So this whole notion of he's going to be sued and everybody's shocked he's not doing Christmas songs. It wasn't a live show. It was broadcast in the summer and it's shown at Christmas time. Now, also... this whole notion of Elvis weeping for RFK and for MLK, there's no evidence that he ever wept for them. He didn't say anything bad about them, but as far as RFK, especially a very liberal senator, I mean, Elvis was as conservative as they came, a conservative Republican. He famously met with Nixon and wanted to get a badge as a federal agent at large later. Although I will say he also met with Jimmy Carter when Carter was Georgia governor. So then they progressed to Elvis in Vegas starting in '69. Look at these guys, man. So they show Elvis in Vegas. Seemingly he never gains much weight until I think the very last scene in the movie. His weight gain started in 71, 72. When Priscilla left him in 72, that was the last downward slide in his life, and it was all downhill from there. So they show Elvis in Las Vegas, and they show him doing Suspicious Minds. And, Vegas was a great triumph. Can I talk over these guys? But Elvis got bored with Vegas over the years, and they do show him playing there for year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4. They talk briefly about the Aloha from Hawaii special, which was beamed all around the world, the largest telecast ever, Yes, Colonel did set that up, so that was true to form. And he would say things like, $1 million? That's good for me, but what about my boy? And negotiating on napkins with the owner of the International Hotel, which was actually, by that time, the Las Vegas Hilton and Baron Hilton. Yes, that's true. That was done on napkins in the ballroom there. But Colonel wasn't always at every show watching the show from the audience, and he wasn't talking about what Elvis was going to do. Colonel really stayed out of the music end of it. He was there for the business, the bookings, and things like that. So the thing about so in the film they have Priscilla storming out of Graceland and saying the reason she's leaving Elvis is because of the pills. And well, the reality is that she actually came to Vegas when he was performing and told him, actually before he went on a show, or I think it was between shows in Vegas, that she was leaving. Now, she had been going with her then boyfriend, Mike Stone, unbeknownst to Elvis, for at least a year. And that's according to Mike Stone himself, who you can find interviewed on YouTube. So she was in a long-standing relationship already with Mike Stone. I don't know if she told Elvis at the time, but she did say she was leaving, and it was in Vegas. And then famously, when they got alone next, she must have also said, you don't even touch me anymore. You're not even interested in me as a wife, as a woman, as a partner. She said later that Elvis, she didn't use the word rape, but I understand, I think, what he was doing. I think he felt that, I better make some serious love with my woman if I'm going to keep her, because he had stopped. And she was taken aback by the fact that he just sort of took her like that. And she told some of the wives of the Memphis Mafia that he took her. They didn't portray any of that in the film, but that's what happened. And, Elvis always had other women. He always had other women. They don't portray Linda Thompson. Linda Thompson lived with Elvis from 72 to 76. In fact, if Linda Thompson would have been with him the day he died instead of Ginger Alden, I think Elvis would have lived through it, because she wouldn't have let him go in the bathroom alone and slept for hours without checking on him. Elvis in the last 5 years had to be checked on. Elvis almost choked on a peach pit once, and Linda had to call Joe Esposito, and Joe Esposito had to come from the next hotel room and stick his fingers down Elvis's throat and clear it, or Elvis would have died then. Elvis went through some ODs in the 70s with girls he was with and by himself. It was very, very bad those last 5 years, and I think that the film was reluctant to show that. The episode where Elvis fires Colonel from stage never happened. What happened was, here's the story. Around 1973, Elvis had a waiter named Mario. Mario would come up and bring food up to the suite in Las Vegas. By the way, the scene in which they say Elvis sometimes spends weeks at a time in his room at Graceland, that's all true. He did in the later years. Sometimes he wouldn't come down for a week at a time, be whole up there with Linda or whoever he was with. Anyway, so Elvis has a waiter named Mario. Mario and by the way, it wasn't still the International Hotel. It was owned by Baron Hilton. I believe that's Paris Hilton's grandfather, and he changed the name to the Las Vegas Hilton. So Elvis is playing the Hilton, and Mario says to Elvis in conversation one day that Mario's wife is dying of cancer. Just the thing to get Elvis, because Elvis believed he could faith heal. He tried to, one time he went over and put a turban on and tried to faith heal Sonny and Judy West's little boy, Brian, that was sick with some malady. He believed he could break his fever by laying hands on him. Elvis really believed he had healing properties. Elvis was always trying to figure out in the 70s what his purpose was. They never mentioned Larry Gellar, who was a hairdresser basically for the stars, and then he became Elvis's sort of spiritual advisor and part of the Memphis Mafia. No mention of him at all, but he really got Elvis into going to Self-Realization Fellowship here in Los Angeles. That's Paramahansa Yogananda. He met with the leader after Paramahansa died, the woman that led the thing, that led the Self-Realization Fellowship, SRF, Sri Dayamata. Elvis got very spiritual. Larry Gellar was a big part of that. And Elvis, like I said, believed in faith healing, that he believed he could see things in the clouds, all kinds of things. power of prayer, deep Christianity, parts of Judaism. Elvis believed correctly that Gladys, his mother, had Jewish blood on her side, and she did. Anyway, so Mario tells Elvis his wife is dying of cancer. Elvis actually goes to Mario's house to comfort Mario's wife and perhaps lay hands and cure her. Well, sometime afterward, the hotel found out, and they somehow put it together and believed that Mario had manipulated Elvis into coming to his house. And they fired Mario. One day a new waiter came up. Elvis says, "Where's Mario?" Mario got fired. Elvis does a little digging. He's furious. He finds out. And he tells, the reality was, he told Colonel, before he went on stage that night, he says, "I'm going to tell these people what Baron Hilton is. You know, he's a cold-hearted son of a bitch for firing Mario. They shouldn't treat people that way," so on and so forth. Colonel advised him not to do it. Don't interfere in the hotel's business. Elvis went on stage and did it anyway. There's recordings of Elvis bashing Baron Hilton and the Hilton organization. And after the show, Colonel and Elvis got into it again. And eventually, Colonel said, "I quit. You're just too dumb. You do a lot of dumb things, and I quit." And Elvis said, his famous line that he used on all the guys multiple times, he said, "You can't quit. I'll fire your ass." So they both went. Elvis said, "I'll hold a press conference tomorrow," and Colonel said, "I'll hold a press conference tonight," or it might have been vice versa. So Colonel went back, and he says, "I'll present a bill to your father in the next couple of days for what you owe me." Well, it's bullshit, because he already took 50%. He didn't know anything, but came back a couple days later, presented a bill of $2 million. Now, Vernon, of course, flipped out. Vernon didn't even want to use the lights in Graceland because he was such a penny pincher, and it sickened Vernon that Elvis would spend so freely on himself, on the guys, mink coats for their wives, buy strangers' cars. I mean, this is part of what gave Vernon 2 heart attacks. But Vernon saw that bill for $2 million. He believed it, and he told Elvis, "We got to make up with Colonel." And Elvis did. He took him back, but their relationship was never the same for the next 4 years. Their relationship was ever all that close, but it was certainly more distant those last couple of years after that incident. Now, it is true that the guys believed that Elvis was an illegal alien, or that Colonel was an illegal alien, which I believe he was, and that's why Colonel would never leave Elvis, travel out of the country, because he had to be with him all the time. But Elvis never discussed Colonel's immigration status on stage, ever. Also, the thing about A Star Is Born, yes, John Peters and his wife, Barbra Streisand, did offer Elvis the part in A Star Is Born. And Elvis was excited about it, but Colonel always screwed up things for him. But it wasn't all Colonel. In the movie, they just have Elvis saying, "Well, Barbara, Colonel," and that phony scene in the limo with Priscilla. Well, the more Elvis thought about it, he didn't want to be bossed around by Barbra Streisand on set, and he feared that he would, two giant egos clashing. He didn't want to take second billing, and the Colonel did what he always did. "Well, the money's fine for me, but what about my boy?" So screwed it up for him, and he never did it. He never could have had that plum roll. That scene in the limo with Priscilla, where she's admonishing Elvis to get some help. "I'll get you checked in," never happened. She might have mentioned Scripps down in San Diego at one time, but there was never an active effort by Priscilla that any of the guys ever said to get him into rehab. If anything, Linda was more active in that department. His last serious girlfriend, I won't even consider Ginger All the serious girlfriend. She didn't even like him. She wouldn't go on tour with him, and she wouldn't live at Graceland. But Linda did all those things, and Linda babied him, took care of him like his mommy, his lover, his everything, which is, I think, what he wanted all along. Should have married her, in my opinion. What happened with Priscilla was, after the divorce, one day Vernon comes up, just beat red-faced, to Elvis, and he says, "You won't believe it, Elvis. You won't believe it." He says, "Priscilla wants the terms of the divorce settlement modified." Basically, Priscilla wanted even more money that she had got in the settlement, and Elvis called her a greedy bitch. And it was really hurtful to him. He says, I've given that woman everything, and she still wants more. And there were times when he was calling her on the phone, calling her all kinds of names, saying he was going to come over and kill Mike Stone. As a matter of fact, he implored Sonny, in a crying fit in front of Linda and a few of the guys, he pulled out a shotgun. He says, Sonny, you got to kill Mike Stone. Look what he's done. He's torn apart my family, driving me to the edge of my sanity. You got to kill him for me. And Sonny actually finally got in touch with the Mafia, and the Mafia was happy to do anything for Elvis. In fact, they would have done it for free. And it came that close. And, a couple days later, Elvis, in a lucid moment, maybe not high anymore or on pills, said, no, forget it, let it go. But Mike Stone was that close to being taken out by by the mob or by Sonny West at Elvis's behest. But anyway, my point is, there was no relationship with Elvis and Priscilla to speak of. Mostly it was on the phone about Lisa. They still fought a lot. Priscilla didn't even like the fact that Elvis was giving Lisa too much under her pillow for the tooth fairy. I mean, it was stuff like that. So this whole thing about I'll love you forever in the limo and all that, Elvis did confess to still loving Priscilla afterwards. I do believe he did. I don't believe he ever told her that, though, afterwards. I believe he was embittered by the divorce and the betrayal, what he believed to be a betrayal for the rest of his life. So at the end, they show, well, I don't want to tell the end if you haven't seen the film, but there's, let's just suffice it to say, there's some real footage. They did add weight to the actor finally, and they show, which this is, Vernon never should have allowed this film to go out. But there was a concert 6 weeks before Elvis's death, which was filmed for television, and they did put it out afterwards. And Elvis looks quite heavy and quite sweaty and quite out of it. But he does an unbelievable version of Unchained Melody with Charlie Hodge standing by him holding the mic to Elvis while he's at the piano. And that is portrayed in the film. And I'll tell you, that's when I got excited. There's some footage of the real Elvis in this film, and that excited me more than anything. I hope I didn't leave out anything other than I have this secret feeling that Jerry Schilling and Priscilla were sort of consultants to this film, and I don't think that's been made public. I only say that because I believe they went to the premiere together. I'm not sure about that, but I know that, like I said, for some reason, they condensed all the major figures in Elvis's life down to one guy, and that's just Jerry. And throughout the film, we hear Jerry, Jerry, Jerry. I don't think and none of the other guys get to utter another line of dialogue. So I think that maybe Jerry was a creative consultant, anonymously, and he said, I'll do it if you, beef up my part. Who knows? And Priscilla raves about the film, and the actress who portrayed Priscilla made her look pretty good, pretty saintly. Not saintly, but there's definitely no criticism of Priscilla in it. She came off looking pretty good. So I'm just wondering if there was something going on with that, whether they were consultants on the film. I don't know if they've been asked that directly, but I just wonder, because Lamar Fike was a consultant, although it wasn't known at the time, on the Albert Goldman book Elvis, which was why a lot of the guys were mad at Lamar for a very long time. But I mean, there's no way. This book came out by Albert Goldman, I believe, in '79. A couple of years later, he did a book on John Lennon, and Goldman couldn't know this information unless somebody in that inner circle was telling him. So unfortunately, all the guys are gone now, basically, except Billy Smith, Elvis's cousin, who was with him basically 24 hours a day the last year of his life. Billy would have been the perfect consultant, especially for the years, 1970 through 77, or even 67 through 77. But what can I tell you? I'm sure he wasn't approached at all. So that's it. Nobody ever called him EP. I don't know why they kept mentioning Tom Diskin also. Tom Diskin working with Colonel all the time. It was odd that they kept bringing up his name throughout the film. Anyway, so those are some of the differences between the reality and the film. Oh, the other thing I wanted to say was during the '68 special, they show Elvis doing If I Can Dream, that song and that unbelievable performance of Elvis in the white suit, because Elvis deliberately wanted to make a sort of a political statement on race relations and other things in the war. Well, the fact is that Elvis always said he was not going to speak publicly about politics or social issues, um, just because he said, and you could see it on film, he says, "I'm just an entertainer." He did that interview in New York, which you can find. He says, "I'm just an entertainer." And basically, there were a couple of reasons he did that. He didn't want to, unlike today's celebrities, he didn't want to offend or push away half his fan base. But like I said earlier, Elvis was a conservative Republican. He had no sympathy for anti-war protesters. He wasn't overly involved in civil rights ever. He just did his thing. He lived in Elvis world in his mind. Like I say, he very much appreciated black music, and he had black acquaintances or / friends, B.B. King and Muhammad Ali. I don't believe Elvis saw race, but I also believe there's no way he was going to go march with, Martin Luther King and the Freedom Riders. He just didn't take it that far. So the whole If I Can Dream thing, I don't think Elvis wanted to particularly do something because it was a political statement song. He just happened to love the song and wanted to push the envelope. Well, I'm sure I can think of more, but those are some differences between the film Elvis and the reality. And if you want to check it out further, guys, I'm just doing this because I've researched Elvis the man, Elvis, his career, but mostly the man, for 30 plus years now. If I were you, my advice to you, if you're interested, this film or my videos or just in life has sparked an interest in researching the real Elvis, there are really two Elvises in my mind. From age 20 to about 35 was one Elvis, and after Priscilla left, there was those terrible last 5 years. I'm not saying it was solely because Priscilla left, but those last 5 years, from when Priscilla left in 72 to 77, were really bad. That's when his health went. That's when his weight ballooned, and that's when the prescription pill misuse became just huge. Like Dr. Nick, they portray in the film, Dr. Nicopolis, I think he lost his license afterwards. It's very much like what happened to Conrad Murray after Michael Jackson died. Rock docs. And Dr. Nick wasn't the only one. He had another doctor who would supply him with pills in Las Vegas and Palm Springs. So anyway, that's the story. Oh, I was going to say, if you really want to learn Elvis, I implore you, read books by the Memphis Mafia or interviews by the Memphis Mafia, or go on YouTube or go on streaming and find anything where those guys are interviewed. Those guys have no axe to grind. There's no reason for them to make it. They loved Elvis. They also lived through all the badness. And by the 90s, there's scenes where they're still crying on film in the interviews 20 years later because he had that much of an impact on their lives. They were not gophers. They were not yes men. They truly loved Elvis, and Elvis loved and needed them. This was a symbiotic relationship. And believe me, they didn't make much money at all. At all. They made, room and board stuff. Sometimes they'd leave. Marty left for a year or two at a time and got other jobs. Lamar was gone by the end. He kicked them out towards the end because the guys were getting on his case about doing drugs, particularly Lamar. And Billy was a little more, because he was his cousin, he was a little more closed about it. He wouldn't lecture him the way Elvis had a very hot temper those last years and was firing people left and right and was going off on these emotional tangents. And as you saw in the film, he was shooting things. He would shoot TVs out. He had a lot of mood swings, and they were made worse with the drugs. Everything was because of his depression, his anxiety, his depression, and his use of drugs to mask that, being prescription pills. Elvis would never go to therapy because he was too macho and too famous to see a therapist. He thought he had it all together on his own. He was as much in denial as any addict had ever been, ever. And you know, if Elvis would have found a way to take off, 50 pounds, 75 pounds, get clean, go to Europe, do some new challenges, maybe a dramatic movie, and a tour in Europe around the world, it would have been a whole, his depression would have, I believe, lifted, and married Linda or a good woman by his side. Everything would have been, but that's a lot to ask for. None of that happened because he didn't let it happen for himself. Okay, guys, Ron here again. This is a long one. Thanks for sticking with me. Again, it's a really interesting film in a lot of ways. If you love it, I don't mean to. I mean, there's people seeing it multiple times, like they did with Titanic. I don't mean to bust anybody's great appreciation and love for this film. I just want people to know fact from fiction. And while it's a stylized, good-looking film and with a good-looking actor who sounds really like Elvis with his speaking voice and singing voice, it's 95% untrue. It's really a fantasy film. Why? I don't know. Why there wasn't more research done on the factual things, I don't know. Maybe it was deliberately done that way, and that's fine, but they should just say this is fiction. Okay, guys, see you at the next location. If you like the channel, please subscribe. Hit the little bell icon next to the subscription button. You'll be notified when I post, and I'll see you at the next location. Thank you. Bye.